Irving Fetscher, Marx's Concretization of the Concept of Freedom. From the Socialist Humanism Compendium, edited by Erich Fromm. Irving Fetscher was for 3 years editor of Marxist Studies, published in Tübingen, Germany, and is author of From Marx to Soviet Ideology, Marxism, Its History and Documents, and Rousseau's Political Philosophy. Born in 1922 in Marbach am Neckar, Irving Fetscher studied philosophy and Romanticism and sociology at the universities of Tübingen, Paris, and Frankfurt. Irving Fetscher's doctoral dissertation was on Hegel's anthropology. At present, Irving Fetscher is professor of political science at the University of Frankfurt am Main. Christ on the cross. I just really didn't want to say present. Okay, now for the actual essay. The young Marx encountered the question of individual freedom in society in two conceptual forms. The liberal concept, most concisely formulated philosophically by Kant, and Hegel's metaphysics of freedom. Both conceptual forms appear as expressions of historically concrete thought within the limitations of a given social and political reality. From the very outset, Marx's theoretical structure and political intention were to surmount, theoretically and practically, the limitation of these conceptions and their complementary abstraction. It is therefore impossible to understand adequately Marx's original political aim without a grasp of how he analyzed these concepts as, quote, bourgeois conceptions of freedom, end quote. For Kant, the principle of political freedom is, quote, that no one can force me, insofar as he considers another person's welfare to be happy in his way, but each must seek his own happiness in the way that suits him best, provided that he permits another the freedom to pursue a similar goal. It is therefore possible to formulate a universal law for the freedom of all, which does not interfere with the freedom of each, end quote. Kant. Freedom is thus the scope for the individual's pursuit of happiness, which is limited only by another individual's equally legitimate pursuit. The obvious deficiency of this concept is that this concept refers only negatively to one's fellow man, viewing one's fellow man solely as the unavoidable legal barrier to one's own individual whim or caprice. This concept necessarily follows if, as with Hobbes and Kant, thought starts from the assumption that man's, quote, unsocial social existence, end quote, is an unyielding fact. If we proceed from the supposition that spontaneous natural man is necessarily hostile to others until a state law forces him to consider the voice of conscience that leads him to respect the freedom claims of his fellow men, then we can find no other but this restrictive relationship between men. For Marx, however, this antagonism of individuals, imputed to nature since Hobbes, is the characteristic only of capitalistic competitive society. Jean-Jacques Rousseau preceded Marx in recognizing the historical nature of, quote, homo lupus. When Rousseau explained that Hobbes's statements could be legitimately applied only to contemporary man and not to man in general. In contrast to Rousseau, however, Marx saw that the free development of the human individual in all societies is tied to the active cooperation of the other individuals. A recognition of this could not break through to full consciousness until the advent of modern, highly specialized society with its division of labor. Whereas Rousseau yearned to turn back to an earlier age, to escape from the mercantilist division of labor of the pre-capitalist society of essentially self-sufficient rural families, which Rousseau knew, Marx looked ahead to a cooperative civilization in which each man would take satisfaction in his own accomplishments, because his own accomplishments contributed to the gratification of others, and would accept the work of others as contributing to his own gratification. Instead of dissolving the mutual relations which correspond to the ideal of the city-state, Marx preferred their universalization and a radical transformation of their character. Marx was not, however, the first to stress the limitations of Kant's conception of the liberal state. Whereas Kant developed the position that the function of the liberal state is to help the individual fulfill himself by securing the peaceful coexistence of naturally egoistical individuals, Hegel sought the freedom of rational citizens not in laws guaranteeing individual freedom of opportunity, but in the state structure itself. In the philosophy of history, Hegel turned specifically against all liberal concepts of freedom, as Marx did later, and condemned all liberal concepts of freedom as mere, quote, negativity and formalism. The state is, quote, not an assemblage of people wherein the freedom of all individuals must be limited. Freedom is only negatively comprehended when freedom is represented as if the individual, in his relations to other individuals, thus limited his freedom in order that this universal limitation, the mutual constraint of all, might secure a small space of liberty for each. End quote. Hegel in Philosophy of History. Already in the Jenenzer Philosophie, Hegel explained, quote, formal freedom as that, quote, whose substance is external to itself, end quote. The substance of freedom for Hegel is the, quote, spirit, or more precisely, what is objective in the living spirit of the Commonwealth's institutions and laws. Although idealistically and mystically embellished, these thoughts were nevertheless perceived by Marx as an essential advance over the Kantian standpoint. To see this, one only has to define, quote, substance as the real society of cooperating people, where the individual's truly human development can occur. The positive relation of the individual to all of the individual's fellow men, first of all incorporated into a state, becomes with Hegel a mere identification of the, quote, subjective spirit of each man with the, quote, objective spirit of the state. With Hegel, dialectical identification, which does not exclude the independent existence of both the individual and the state as fixed poles in relation to each other, remains merely a thing of ideal dimensions. The living man and the living society, Hegel's, quote, necessary and rational state, end quote, remains below this lofty sphere, quote, in insubstantial appearance, end quote. Fundamentally, Hegel has only exchanged one abstraction for another abstraction. Whereas the liberal concept of freedom is based on the positive relationship between people and expressed the restraints determined by the psychic demands of people in competitive society, the Hegelian state metaphysic says that man finds and can exercise freedom in the ideal realm, not in his workaday personal relationships. Indeed, Hegel asserted that, quote, the state is the reality in which the individual has his freedom, end quote. But the ideal state is not the human environment in real, quote, civil society. The ideal state is the world of production, exchange and industry, and here man must seek his freedom. Marx's critique demonstrated the historical basis of the liberal concept of freedom and showed that the liberal concept of freedom remained confined within the socially and temporally limited horizon of bourgeois thought. In the case of the Hegelian concept, Marx indicates that it is illusory and complementary. In the case of the Hegelian concept, Marx indicates that the Hegelian concept's illusory and complementary character becomes apparent against the reality of bourgeois society. Marx's most thoroughgoing critique of the bourgeois thesis of freedom and the rights of man is found in Capital. Quote, "This sphere of circulation and commodity exchange that we are deserting, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. There alone freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Freedom because both buyer and seller of a commodity, say of labor power, are constrained only by their own free will. They contract as free agents, and the agreement they come to is but the form in which they give legal expression to their common will. Equality because each enters into relation with the other, as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property because each disposes only of what is his own, and Bentham because each looks only to himself. The only force that brings them together and puts them in relation with each other is the selfishness, the gain, the private interest of each. Each looks to himself only, and no one troubles himself about the rest, and just because they do so, they do all in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an all-shrewd providence, work together to the mutual advantage, for the common weal, and in the interest of all." End quote. Marx in Capital. Marx showed that the freedom and equality guaranteed in the French Constitution as the rights of man, and taken over in similar form by all liberal democratic constitutions, was an adequate expression of human relations in a market society, where no one's social condition is fixed by the privileges of birth, and everyone, as a quote, commodity owner, is free to dispose of his goods and is bound only by the terms of the contract to which he agreed. But the sale of the labor power commodity, this apparent equality and freedom, is actually false. The actual inequality of ownership lies in the fact that the owners of labor power have nothing to sell but their labor power, and are therefore compelled, although not by law, to part with their labor power, or as German so graphically puts it, to quote, "to contract oneself out," end quote. Their labor power, unlike the objective goods a craftsman brings to market, is not an objective part of their being, but objective ability itself. Man's essence is man's ability to transform nature creatively and to shape nature to man's wishes and ends. When man is forced to sell this ability, he renounces this humanity, and an alienated relationship to mankind and humanity results. The liberal conception of freedom is limited because the liberal conception of freedom attributes man's calculated special interest to man's essence, whereas in actuality this characterization only reflects man in competitive society, and may be wrong about both the past and the future. Marx shows Hegel's metaphysics of the state as the abstract complementary of the idea of freedom already expressed by bourgeois democracy in the Constitution of the French Revolution. Marx's criticism of the Hegelian philosophy of right was that it explained the bourgeois democratic state, which Hegel... I'm getting my mind's turning into a very stale marshmallow. Let me get back to where I was. Marx shows Hegel's metaphysics of the state as the abstract complementary of the idea of freedom already expressed by bourgeois democracy in the Constitution of the French Revolution. Marx's criticism of the Hegelian philosophy of right was that the Hegelian philosophy of right explained the bourgeois democratic state, which Hegel, as a German, first encountered only in the bourgeois democratic state's theoretical, ideological form. The superiority of the Hegelian conception over the liberal was, as we have already seen, the Hegelian conception's ability to grasp the dialectical relationship of the individual to society. We find the same recognition again in Marx, no matter whether he gained it from Hegel or from the experience of social reality itself. Quote, "It is above all necessary to avoid postulating society once again as an abstraction confronting the individual. The individual is the social being. The definition of the individual's life, even when it does not appear directly in the form of a communal manifestation, accomplished in association with other men, is therefore a manifestation and affirmation of social life." End quote. Marx. As we have already seen, for Marx, the Hegelian conception fails because the Hegelian conception presents the social individual only in the idealistic abstract form of subjective and objective spirit, and relegates concrete man, the sensuous real being, as well as the civil society formed by man, to a sphere of lower rank. Man, as a socially related being, is suspended in an illusory and imaginary sphere beyond civil society, with its calculated intelligence, its private egoism, its work, its law, and its competition. But Marx realized that the abstraction of Hegelian philosophy from concrete daily life was no accident. It was only possible for, quote, German thought to abstract its notion of the modern state from the natural man, while and insofar as the modern state was itself abstracted from actual people, or the whole man gratified himself only in an imaginary manner, end quote. Man lived in this, quote, modern state only in the abstract form of citizen, citoyen, during the course of his real... Excuse me, I messed up there. But Marx realized the abstraction of Hegelian philosophy from concrete daily life, was no accident. It was only possible for, quote, German thought to abstract its notion of the modern state from the natural man, while and insofar as the modern state was itself abstracted from actual people, or the whole man gratified himself only in an imaginary manner, end quote. Marx. Man lived in this, quote, modern state only in the abstract form of citizen, citoyen, during the course of his real sensuous existence as a member of the bourgeois competitive society. As a citizen, he might be part of the civil society and imagine himself dialectically united with the rest of the citizens in the community, but in his real sensuous existence he is unfree and isolated, subject to alien laws, contingency, and can relate himself to his fellow man only negatively, i.e. as competitor. Quote, the completed political state, end quote, Marx writes in 1843, quote, is in its essence the species life of man in opposition to his material life. all presuppositions of his egoistical life continue to exist outside of the state sphere in civil society. Where the political state has reached the political state's true development, man leads a double life, heavenly and earthly, not only in thought, in consciousness, but in actuality, in life. Life in the political community in which he recognizes himself as a social being, and life in civil society where he acts as a private person, looks upon other people as means, and is himself degraded into a means and becomes the plaything of alien forces. End quote. Marx. Man's, quote, true life should be in community with his fellow men, each fulfilling himself and relating to the others in enriching accomplishment. But this, quote, true life exists in the modern world only as the illusory and transcendental form of the community of citizens that is first tangibly experienced when it closes ranks and is brought into hostile relations with the community of citizens of another state. In their real daily existence, on the other hand, individuals lead a, quote, untrue life, a life of deliberate isolation and hostility against their fellow men. Quote, actual man is first recognized in the form of egoistical, untrue individuals, true men in the form of abstract, unactual citizen. End quote. I'm going to assume that's Marx. This analysis posed the task of developing the actual untrue person of civil society into a true person, conscious of his dialectical relationship with his fellow men. In his early writings, Marx formulated the task in this way, quote, only when actual man takes back into himself the abstract citizen of the state, and as an individual man in his empirical life, in his individual work, in his individual relations, has become species essence. Only when man has recognized and reorganized his forces propres as social powers, and therefore no longer separates from himself social power in the form of political power, only then is human emancipation completed. In his works of the 1840s and 1850s, particularly in the extracts and in the outline to the critique of political economy, Marx left us detailed information about the concrete free man who, quote, in his individual work, in his individual relation, has become, his works of the 1840s, particularly in the extracts and in the outline of the critique to the critique of political economy, Grundrisse, Marx left us detailed information about this concrete free man who, quote, in his individual work, in his individual relations, has become species essence, end quote. Man is, quote, species essence when man no longer projects his inherent qualities into an otherworldly being, as according to Feuerbach happened with religious reification, or as in political alienation, no longer poses a world beyond the existing everyday bourgeois state. According to his natural abilities, then, every individual has acquired all-roundedness, which for him and with him living humanity has realized by humanized work. Only when he is liberated from the, quote, idiocy of lifelong fixation to a trade and from the slavery of wage labor will such all-rounded appropriation of species life by the individual be possible. Only when this is realized can the state and religious ideology wither away as the necessary complement to the incomplete actuality of society and society's members. the state's becoming superfluous is specifically linked above all to the abolition of economic class privileges. With economic class privileges abolition, the necessity for the forcible protection of the privileged against the underprivileged is also abolished. The superfluity of the democratic state is dependent on the rise of a society in which the individuals have become, quote, species beings, who relate themselves totally and positively to their fellow men. The barriers to individual freedom in the, quote, political state were and remain necessary as long as real inequality in the opportunity for individual development remains and the, quote, alienation of all is not overcome. With the elimination of property privileges, a decisive step is taken, but the end not yet attained. As long as it is not yet possible to reduce working time so that the necessary tasks of all can be fulfilled voluntarily, and the productivity of all suffices to satisfy the total needs of each, inequality remains the real prospect, and therewith the, quote, unfreedom of the concrete individual remains. As long as the gratification of my needs remains mediated not through my claim as man, but through my purse, and this is surely the case today even in the, quote, socialist states, there can be no talk that human development of which the young Marx spoke has come true. In the excerpts as well as the economic essays originating in the years 1844 and 1845, Marx opportunely worked out the idea of alienated, commodity-producing society pregnant with the future unalienated human society. In these formulations, one can clearly gather the sense which the concept of, quote, human emancipation, the liberation of concrete man, had for Marx. Division of labor in the technical sense is the prerequisite of both forms of society, but in the one, the division of labor in the technical sense is tied to the egoistical isolation of each individual, and in the other society, to the loving relationship of each for all. The following description is valid according to Marx for commodity society. Quote, I have produced for myself and not for you, as you have produced for yourself and not for me. The result of my production has in and of itself just as little direct relation to you as the result of your production has to me, i.e., our production is not production of people for people as people, i.e., not social production. As human beings, thus, none of us has a relationship of gratification to the product of the other. Our mutual production has no existence for us as people. Our exchange can therefore also not be the mediating movement wherein it is acknowledged that my product is for you at the same time as it is a materialization of your being, your needs. For not the human essence is the bond of our production for each other. End quote. Marx. The simple commodity system, even more the expanding capitalistic system, is already exposed here as one in which the universal dependence of all on the products of work, differentiated by division of labor, does not appear as a spontaneous, joyous, beneficent working of each for the others, the actualization of the, quote, fundamental nature of man, end quote, for the human needs of other people, but as an egoistical working of each only for himself, only indirectly, through the compulsion to exchange on the market, and, quote, behind the back, does production also become production for others. It is certainly not a relation between people, but only between, quote, solvent buyers, end quote. Every single person or group of people satisfies the human needs of other people according to, quote, aesthetic laws, end quote, and other such characteristically established rules. Great poetry is meaningful to the poetic understanding, a symphony to the musical ear, painting to the cultured taste, etc. But these appropriate attributes of people, the ability to enjoy, hear, and see, do not mediate people's, quote, appropriation, but only the disposition of money. Specific products are not for me or you as people, but for you and me only insofar as we are commodity owners, money owners. Specific products are also not created for us, but for our money. Not for socially related men, but for the objectified embodiment of society, money. In a truly, quote, human society, where individuals are not mutual barriers to their freedom, but discover the individual's essence as fulfilled and enriched beings, the following description would become valid. Quote, granted, we have produced as people. In his production, each of us has twice affirmed himself and the other. In production, I found my individuality and my particularity materialized, and therefore in the course of the activity I enjoyed a personal expression of life as well as a sense of the individual joy in the contemplation of my personality as objective, sensually perceptible, and indubitable power. 2. In your satisfaction, your use of my products, I had immediate satisfaction as well as consciousness that my work satisfied a human need. Therefore, I, as an objective human being, have produced an object corresponding to another human being's need. 3. I became for you the mediator between you and the species. Thus I became a necessary, self-conscious, and sentient part of your fulfillment of your essence. Thus I knew I was affirmed in your thought as well as in your love. In my individual expression of life, I directly created your expression of life. Thus my true essence, my actualized species essence, was confirmed in my immediate individual activity. Our productions were so many mirrors reflecting our being. End quote. Marx. Here the evil magic of commodity-producing society, of exchange mediated through egoism, of products fragmented and losing their specific character, even disregarding the real transformation in labor itself, is dissolved. The variegated world of human products is transformed from a distorted mirror, where alienated man meets his likeness. Here the evil magic of commodity-producing society, of exchange mediated through egoism, of products fragmented and losing the product's specific character, even disregarding the real transformation in labor itself, is dissolved. The variegated world of human products is transformed from a distorted mirror, where alienated man meets his likeness as a materialized commodity, into a true mirror of social humanity. The effort of all men becomes dependent upon the needs of others, as if the effort of the lover who composes a song The effort of all men becomes dependent upon the needs of others, as is the effort of the lover who composes a song for his beloved. Marx was no dreamer who expected the immediate realization of his ideal of the human world, but I am convinced that despite many cautious remarks at a later period, Marx always held fast to the concept of human potential, the mastery of nature by associated mankind, and the increase in labor productivity are certainly necessary preconditions for such emancipation from the alienated and reified world, but they are not yet liberation itself. Never did Marx see in the mere mastery of man over nature the meaning of history and the essence of liberation to which socialism summons. One may almost cite the biblical phrase, quote, "For what is a man profited if he shall gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" End quote. Also for Marx, it would have helped little to achieve a perfect mastery of nature without bringing about the society in which freely associated people, it's almost me, for also Marx, it would have helped little to achieve a perfect mastery of nature without bringing about the society in which freely associated people remold their nature. The mastery over nature is not, quote, anti-nature, but, quote, pro-humanity, end quote. The goal is the elimination of egoism and of the rule of man over man. However, as long as freedom and happiness have not yet become concrete realities, the two abstract concepts of freedom retain an actual importance, notwithstanding the valid reservations we have become acquainted with. In all countries, including the socialist countries, an inevitable bit of democratic metaphysics lies hidden, In all countries, including the socialist countries, an inevitable bit of democratic metaphysics lies hidden, inevitable ideology. Precisely because individual labor output results not from joyous spontaneity and love of fellow man, but from, quote, material interest, the picture of an antagonistic society, the state, must appear as the complement of the still unsocial society. Nor may it be identified with that communistic society which alone connects spontaneous human beings producing for each others. Each state, including the, quote, people's democracies, remains in, quote, illusory social essence, end quote, that can, quote, become superfluous, end quote, and then, quote, wither away, only when a true social essence, in the sense Marx outlined, originates underneath. But the liberal conception to which we were introduced in the classical Kantian formulation retains its relative significance during this entire time. It appears necessary and correct because it secures a scope of freedom for egoistical, unsocial individuals. It appears in optimal form when an enforceable law separates the freedom of the individual not only from another individual, but also from the superior power of the government. The liberal conception appears in optimal form when an enforceable law separates the freedom of the individual not only from another individual, but also from the superior power of the government. The liberal ideology, which believes the maximum of human freedom to be attained with this kind of guarantee, must certainly be opposed. Hegel and Marx clearly enough stress the narrowness and abstractness of this concept of freedom. But as long as the human society described by Marx is not realized and the majority of individuals, even in the, quote, socialist countries, are driven by egoistical motives in the performance of their work, those liberal guarantees can in no way be dispensed with. Those liberal guarantees need above all to be concretized by supplementary measures guaranteeing the right of usufruct, education, medical care, universal social security, etc. These measures are not superfluous as long as competitive envy and real inequality continue as essential characteristics of society. Misuse of freedom must also be prevented by the suitable interpretation of the Kantian formula. The freedom for the economic enslavement of fellow men does not belong to those actions, quote, which can coexist with the freedom of the will of each and all according to a universal law, end quote. Let me repeat that. Freedom for the economic enslavement of fellow men does not belong to those actions, quote, which can coexist with the freedom of the will of each, and all according to a universal law. As long as concrete freedom is not realized, the two complementary abstract forms of freedom retain their restricted and historically limited validity. Translated by Raya Dunayevskaya.